Well, South Africa needs to be more bold about its economic structural reform. That's the word from Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, and he now has the backing from President Cyril Ramaphosa. University of Western Cape's political economy professor, Patrick Bond, joins us via Skype from Johannesburg. Prof, a very good morning to you. I would argue that the Finance Minister has always had the backing of the President. Perhaps the question here is about just how bold is bold.
Well, there's a bigger question, isn't there, Claudia, which is what is the definition of reform? Because you can read it either from what we call a neoliberal, which is to cut the budget and impose austerity and privatize and fire civil servants, reform, kind of structural reform that the credit rating agencies, the International Monetary Fund, the banks, the conservative media, to be frank, many wealthier white people desire. But there's a different reform, and that's one that even someone as, let's say, unusual as Boris Johnson has adopted, and that's to have a much larger increase in emergency state spending because the economy is in such a crisis. In his case, nearly 19% of GDP. In contrast, we're looking at 1.1 to 0.2%. And to have public works programs that are done safely, to roll out the emergency requirements to survive this crisis. So there are two types of reform, aren't there? Unfortunately, it looks to me that the Treasury has chosen the same old way, which is the neoliberal strategy.
Prof, we are in a recession, and there's no telling when we will come out of that. We have also just been downgraded to junk by Moody's. Where exactly are we going to go in as far as international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank? We know that for the moment, the Finance Minister has said those institutions will only be approached for relief on COVID-19.
Well, this is a bit of a fiction because money is fungible. That means that you can borrow for one thing and say you're borrowing it for it, but you do another with it. And in the case of the World Bank, the main thing that they want from us is to repay the loan for the Medupi coal-fired power plant that they lent in 2010. It was the largest loan they've ever made, $3.75 billion US. It's in the range of 60 billion rand. And I think the most difficult problem here is that loan could be considered odious, and we're paying a very high interest on that and the other Eskom debt, even though the lender, at that point a man called Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, knew that it was corrupt because Hitachi, the Japanese company, had bribed our ruling party, the African National Congress, through its Chancellor House arm. This is not disputed. Chancellor House, more or less pled guilty. Hitachi paid a big fine for it. And the really interesting problem is if you're borrowing from the World Bank simply to pay back World Bank loans, if you're borrowing from the International Monetary Fund to pay back international creditors who made these corrupt loans, we should instead consider declaring the kind of force majeure that apparently Eskom has just done against the renewable energy producers and just say, look, we can't pay, we won't pay, rather than take on new loans to pay back old loans. Let's question the legitimacy. And I must say that the World Bank president at the moment, David Malpass, himself has gone into the U.S. Congress in 2017 and said that those were corrupt loans. They shouldn't have been repaid. I don't know why our people in Eskom and the Treasury haven't begun to think more creatively. The other big thing we need to do is to stop money from fleeing with very tight exchange controls. This was done in 1985 in a similar crisis of flooding money out of the country. And again, these are the kinds of ideas that I think it's now time to put onto the policy table. This is not unusual. I mean, there are many countries that put on exchange controls during crises, and they, as a result, survive much better than those that don't.
Yeah, Prof, you mentioned in your first response that the Finance Minister has opted for the option that the governing party has always done in this country, and that's the neoliberal route. Is there a middle ground here, Prof?
Well, it's an emergency, and with the private sector flat on its back, anybody who's been at least aware of what was at the time called Keynesian economics, when the private sector is sick, the state has to come in. This is standard capitalist survival techniques. This is something John Maynard Keynes described in the 1930s during the Great Depression. We are not in a recession. I think we're definitely in a depression. That's usually when it's in the range of 4 quarters or more of negative GDP. We'll soon learn that, but also that we lose 10%. And I think there's no question we're going to lose 10% of GDP. If it's a depression in the private sector, then the state has to come in. Now, the question is, where would you borrow the money? And we just had the answer last week from the South African Reserve Bank Governor, Lesotho Kanyako, who found a lot of money to buy treasury bills when nobody else would. This is the kind of creative technique that in a crisis the state must resort to. And structural reform of the old-fashioned way, which is you cut the state, you privatize, you cut a civil service that's very, very nervous right now, of 1.4 million people, worrying will they be basically paid as they were expected on a 3-year contract. These are the big questions, I think, for this government, whether it wants to sink deeper, doing the same old thing that doesn't work, or become more creative. And I think actually they'll have to, just as Boris Johnson. He doesn't want to have big public works programs and spend money and give people grants, nor does Donald Trump. They just agreed on $2 trillion. But they are, because the private sector is so sick, and the same is true here.
Prof, very, very interesting insights indeed. Professor Patrick Bond, he is the political economy professor at the University of the Western Cape. He says that the economy is sick. In fact, the private sector is sick, but even more worrying, he says we are in a depression as opposed to a recession.